the hall. Good morning. My name is Mark Tobey. I'm the Agriculture Counsel at the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department. We next have this panel on profit margins or price spreads in the dairy industry. Just to give you a teaser about what we're going to try to talk about today, we're going to take aim at two fairly complex questions that have come up in our past discussions about the dairy industry. As many of you may know, we had an entire competition workshop devoted to the dairy industry in June of this year in Madison, Wisconsin. And at that discussion, there were a couple of questions that seemed to be worth discussing today and having further discussions about. One of those questions is, does the available evidence suggest that firms at any particular stage in the supply chain for milk are making more profits than in the past? And if so, why has this changed? The second big general question that I think we're going to try to take aim at is many industry participants at that Wisconsin Dairy Workshop say that they have seen an apparent disconnect between the grocery store price of milk and the price paid to farmers. We would like to figure out, what does the available evidence suggest about the relationship between grocery store prices and farm prices for milk. And I will say that our focus today is going to primarily be on fluid milk rather than on other dairy products like cheese, although I'm sure it will come up. This is a 1-hour panel. Let me tell you what the procedure will be. I'll introduce everyone. We'll give a question to everyone to kind of get the discussion going, and then we'll try to get a discussion going between the panel members. I believe that we are prepared, although the logistics of this are a little not transparent to me, to take written questions from the audience. And at some point in time, I think someone will come down both aisles and pick up written questions. So if you have written questions, we're not going to do the mics for this session. We'll do the open mic after this session. If you have written questions that you would like this panel to address, if we have time to do so, please pass them to the aisle and someone will come and collect them. And they will be taken up to my colleague from the Justice Department, a very fine dairy economist named Sheldon Kimmel, who will go through the questions and then pass them on to me. So in order to address these two rather complex questions, we have a very distinguished panel today comprised of two producers from different parts of the country and different size of producer. We have a state regulator from Pennsylvania, and we have two economists who have looked extensively at pricing in dairy markets. Let me introduce the members of our panel today. Starting at my right, Chuck Nicholson is an associate professor of agribusiness at California Polytechnic University. He grew up in San Diego and graduated from UC Davis. He subsequently worked for the Congressional Budget Office here and served as an agricultural extension agent with the Peace Corps in Africa. He also worked for an economics consulting firm here in D.C., went on to get his MS and doctorate degree from Cornell, and was a Rockefeller Foundation Social Science Fellow at the International Livestock Research Institute in Ethiopia. He has served on the faculty at the University of Vermont and at Cornell prior to being at Cal Poly. Next to him is Eunice Beal, who, along with her husband and son and daughter-in-law, operate a dairy farm near Harmony, Minnesota, in Fulmore County. Their family operates 950 acres and grows corn, soybeans, hay, and they milk 150 cows. Eunice's education includes a master's degree in public affairs from the University of Minnesota and a Bachelor of Arts degree in communication from Winona State University. She's been very involved in farm policy at many levels, including being an officer in the Minnesota Farmers Union. Next to me here is Buster Goff. Buster was raised on a dairy farm in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and began his own operation in 1973 with 40 cows. He grew that herd to nearly 200 cows and spent the next 25 years operating in New Mexico as a producer handler. In the late 1990s, Buster and his family decided to become part of DFA, and they expanded their herd dramatically. He and his wife milk 8,000 cows today in the Hobbs, New Mexico area. Their operation also includes 3,000 acres that are double cropped in corn and wheat and 12,000 acres of grassland, which satisfy about 30% of their dairy feed needs. He's been a recipient of New Mexico's Agriculturalist of the Year Award and received an Entrepreneurial Award and the Free Enterprise Award from the College of the Southwest. Next to me on my left is David DeSantis, who currently serves as the chief of the Enforcement and Accounting Division of the Pennsylvania Milk Marketing Board. This comprises a staff of milk marketing auditors, market examiners, investigators, accountants, and other specialists who monitor and regulate the marketing of milk in the state of Pennsylvania. David has represented that board before the state legislature and in hearings with government officials in an attempt to improve regional milk marketing in the Pennsylvania area. On the end there is Rigoberto Lopez, who is professor and head of the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of Connecticut. He is the interim director of the newly created Charles Zwick Center for Food and Resource Policy. He received his PhD in Food and Resource Economics from the University of Florida in 1983. Dr. Lopez has published extensively on industrial concentration and pricing in the food channels, including those for milk products, and among his publications was one that won the Outstanding Journal Article Award in Agribusiness in 2009. So that's our panel. We want to talk about pricing in the food channel for milk. So as an overview, let me now turn to Professor Chuck Nicholson. Chuck, can you give us an overview of the supply chain for dairy products, primarily fluid milk, from the dairy farmer through product manufacturers and retailers? Talk a little bit about how prices and costs move down that chain, and maybe give us a view of what you think margins look like in the dairy industry.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Mark has apparently worked with academics before because he said he was going to be very strict about the time we have. And so the tasks he's given me to describe the supply chain and the margins and how they've changed over time is a little bit challenging. But I'm going to try and do this in about 6 different points and not use up more time than he's asked me to. So the first description of the supply chain that I would give you for dairy is that it is diverse. And that means that it incorporates a bunch of different folks who have different roles. Of course, we have dairy farmers. Dairy cooperatives are also very important. We have fluid milk processors and dairy product manufacturers. We have food retailers. We have food service. Restaurants and food retailers are also part of the supply chain. And one of the things that we need to keep in mind is there are a bunch of different dairy products, even though we'll focus on fluid milk this morning. And the supply chains and the amount of product moving directly through to retail is very different for products. For fluid milk, the retail share is fairly high. For a product like cheese, it's less than half. It's usually about 30%, the rest going through food service and restaurants. Okay? I'll also say that foreign buyers of dairy products have become more important to the U.S. in recent years. Dairy cooperatives also play an important role as manufacturers of dairy products in addition to providing other services to their members. And I'll also quickly mention that the dairy supply chain is influenced to no small amount by what state and federal governments do in terms of regulating milk prices and other programs to support dairy farmers. Okay. So that's the brief overview. What I also want to offer is, from my perspective, one of the key issues that the dairy supply chain faces and has been dealing with for at least the past 10 years, if not longer, is price volatility. And the big issue with price volatility is that it tends to result in periods where we have significant financial distress, and it's hard for me to find the words severe enough to describe that, significant financial distress for dairy farmers. And the past 2 to 3 years have been particularly challenging in that regard, with first record high milk prices in 2007, and then not record low milk prices, but a very significantly bad combination of low milk prices and high feed costs. I will also note quickly, though, that I don't think that the cycles that we've seen that cause so much distress in dairy are really that closely related to any of the things that we've seen changing with margins. Okay? Moving on to talk about marketing margins for dairy, I want to focus on a couple of the challenges of measuring and interpreting them, and then say a little bit about how they've changed over time. One of the challenges is that the milk price that farmers see in a milk check every month, and we price milk monthly in the U.S., is not the same price that any buyer of milk pays. And that sounds funny, but the reason for that is that we have federal and state regulation that provide minimum prices based on the use to which the milk is put. And so that means that different buyers of milk will be paying different prices, even within the same month. And the farmers actually receive a weighted average of those different prices based on the use that the milk is put to. Okay? So the other thing is related to that is that most buyers of milk pay something above the additional or the minimum regulated prices, but we usually don't know exactly how much they pay. So that makes for some challenges in figuring out exactly what the costs are to different actors in the supply chain. The second challenge is that we do have information on prices at the farm, sometimes at the wholesale level and at the retail level. But that really only tells us what a gross marketing margin is if we subtract the retail price from the farm price. And that gross margin is actually different than what we would usually think of as profit. It includes the costs of processing, packaging, transporting, and selling milk and dairy products. And that means basically that an increase in the marketing margin does not necessarily mean that any particular actor in the chain is seeing increased profitability. Public information about the actual costs of the processing, packaging, transporting, and selling otherwise is much more limited than the information we have about prices, and that was mentioned for beef during the first panel. Okay. So with those challenges in mind, I will say that the average gross marketing margins for both cheese and the focus of this panel, fluid milk, have increased in the past 10 years. But I'll also note that they have varied over time, and to a certain extent they appear to be related to cost increases in the rest of the milk supply chain. As quick examples, the gross margin for fluid milk, by at least one calculation that I've done, increased from $1.60 a gallon in 2000 to about $1.75 a gallon in 2010. The gross margin between the wholesale and retail price for cheese increased from about $2.75 a pound to about $3 a pound, again in the period from 2000 to 2010. Associated with that, however, are costs increased for labor, energy, and packaging that dairy processors and fluid milk processors paid during that same time period. And finally, to wrap this up, I want to state that the prices that we have at the different market levels in the dairy supply chain do, in general, at least when measured at a national average level, tend to move fairly closely together. And as you can clearly see from the handout that I guess that's not going to work so much. So basically the farm equivalent price, that is what first buyers of milk are paying, the wholesale and retail prices for cheese tend to move together over time, and the same is true actually also for fluid milk. We don't see full and complete what's called pass-through of cost increases or decreases from the farm level to the retail level for dairy products in general. We see that retailers are known to practice what's called price smoothing, so they don't fully pass through the increases or decreases. And this has meant that the farm share of the fluid milk retail value has varied over time from 30% at a low when farm milk prices are low to about 50% when farm milk prices are high. And I'll close by saying there appears to be a common perception that retailers in particular don't pass through cost decreases from the farm level to consumers. It's true that we don't see necessarily full pass-through, but they do in fact pass through some portion of price decreases when the farm milk price goes down based on data from a variety of cities and a variety of time periods. So I hope that met the criteria for time and for content.
I am truly amazed, Chuck. You could be on a panel of mine anytime. We'll come back to some of the points that you've made as an overview, but I think we want to step back now and hear from our producers, the people that actually, produce the fluid milk that we buy in the stores, and look at the world from their perspective. And so now let's turn to Eunice Beal. Eunice, I've talked a little bit in your introduction about your farming operation in Minnesota, but could you tell us a little bit more and then talk to us a little bit about how your milk gets marketed, what options you might have if you were dissatisfied with the way your milk was marketed, and what you see happening to the price of milk as it moves from your farm to the grocery store.
Okay, thank you. Well, as you said, we raise corn, oats, and soybeans. We market some of our corn and some of our soybeans, and we raise all of our replacement heifers, and we also feed out our Holstein steers. Our son and his wife Kelly help us. They do like a lot of the herd maintenance and the breeding. And I just wanted to say that in 2009, when prices were so low, it was quite a struggle to do the basic maintenance with the cattle, keep them fed correctly. We didn't even do the dairy herd improvement every month where they measure our milk. We kind of had to put that on hold. You cannot stop doing herd health. You cannot stop like the hoof trimming, the basic. You have to feed your cows. You have to take care of them. You have to keep them bedded. You have to keep them fed. And the expenses with the fuel, the cost of the fuel, the cost of feed. At one time, several times, the cost of the feed bill would be higher than the milk check. And our only saving grace was that we had Holstein steers to market. I mean, we had enough room, and not very many people do that. Not many people are able to do that. Our milk goes to AMPI and most associated milk producers in Rochester, Minnesota, and 85 to 90% of the milk in Rochester goes to cheese, and the 10 to 15% goes to fluid milk and is sold to Kemp's. And there's 14 different cheese manufacturing divisions in the Midwest. We're strictly regulated, as you will know. Dairy is a very strictly regulated industry. Every time the milk truck comes to pick up our milk, they take a sample, and that sample has to pass muster before they can. Every sample from the tank of the truck has to pass, or else the truck can't be unloaded. And if there was anything wrong with the load of milk, they could trace it back to the dairy producer. So we're very strictly regulated, and that's fine. We're proud of the fact that in the United States we have the most safest, purest dairy products in the world. But after 2009, I guess we'll never regain the assets that we lost. We're still struggling. Everybody thinks that the price went up a little bit, but the expenses have also risen significantly. And now the futures for first quarter of 2011, it's hit a new low of $13.41. Our last milk check was an average of $16. And you can kind of, we don't know exactly the cost of production. They're around $15, so it's pretty tight just to make ends meet on $16. I guess if we didn't sell our milk to AMPI, there are other co-ops in the area. We could sell to Llano Lakes, Foremost Farms, and there's a Plainview Milk Co-op. But the problem is we're 50 miles from Rochester, and we have enough neighbors, so the milk truck will come down and pick up our milk, and he'll get a load. Well, if many more dairy farmers in our county or our neighbors go out of business, will they want to come down for our milk for 140 cows? And that's kind of a, and will we be able to get a veterinarian? And will we be able to get other services in our area? Minnesota currently has 4,500 dairy farmers. It's an average herd of, the average herd size in Minnesota is 105 cows. And we're right now we're working with manure feedlot rules in Minnesota. And that's going to be a big expense, even with cost sharing. And our question is, if the corn gets to be $6 and milk stays around $13, well, we want to spend several $100,000 to upgrade our facility so that a young farmer who dearly wants to raise cattle and farm with us, our son and his family, he was even thinking of, if milk prices are staying high, they're thinking of looking into robotic milkers, because that's kind of turning into be the thing for medium to size, any size farmer. But the cost is quite a commitment for the future if you don't know if you'll be able to meet your expenses. If the milk price had kept up with the price of parity, which was taken away in 1981, we wouldn't be getting such a poor price. We'd be getting a much better price, and there wouldn't have been the volatility. I feel that the volatility really started after 1981 when the price of parity was taken away.
Thank you very much. Buster Goff, you're in New Mexico and you have a substantially larger operation. Do you have some of the same issues?
Yes, thank you, Mark. Yes, we have a lot of the same issues that Eunice has talked about. It seems like 2009 was the lowest that we've experienced since I've been dairying.
Can you hear okay, or is it okay? See if maybe that mic is not doing well. Let's give you mine.
I don't want yours. Just bring them all together. Just get them all here. Yes, we've experienced the same, a lot of the same things. We in 2009 we had 3 months that I had to go all the way back to the mid 70s to compare the milk price, and with that we saw, of course, the feed cost and the operational costs much different than we had in the 70s. Because of what we've experienced in volatility, we have began to look more and more into risk management of our feeds and our milk. We think that's going to help. It certainly isn't the solution, but I think I know our lenders are very interested in us trying to take out some of these lows that we've experienced the last couple of years. The lows are longer and the highs don't last very long anymore. And that's one of the reasons why we haven't been able to get through very well these last few years. We've always operated on highs and lows, but it's just been the lows just keep getting longer. I've spent most of my career as an independent producer, handler, where I operated a dairy and a small bottling plant and marketed my milk direct to the consumer or into stores. And so in 1998, I had decided to close that plant and focus strictly on a dairy herd. I have a choice of 4 co-ops that I can market my milk with, and 1 independent cheese plant is available. And the last couple of years, there's been at least 1 Class 1 processor that has started contracting some small amounts of milk in our area. We've chosen to market our milk with DFA. We're very happy with DFA. We like the security knowing that we get paid on a regular basis, and I think you get that when you operate with co-ops. I guess as an independent, I wasn't always that secure. I did worry a little bit about accounts receivable and about the balancing of my milk on exactly where I'm going to sell my milk the next day. So the co-op has really helped level that out and help us know that we do have a market for our milk.
All right. Thank you, Buster. Obviously, the ups and downs and the cost structure of being a dairy farmer these days presents a lot of challenges, and the state of Minnesota has taken a different approach. The state of Pennsylvania has taken a different approach to some of these problems, and with me today is David DeSantis. David, can you tell us a little bit about how Pennsylvania has decided to approach the issue of the pricing of milk?
Yes, good morning. Just to give you a brief overview of the Pennsylvania program, it's one of the most comprehensive pricing programs anywhere in the states. We start with a producer price, which is pretty much the same classified pricing system that the feds have established. Our price for Class 2, 3, and 4 milk, 3 and 4 being manufactured type grades, is identical to the feds. Where we differ from the feds is in our Class 1 price. We have a premium that is mandated to be paid for all milk that is produced in Pennsylvania, processed in a Pennsylvania plant, and resold in a Pennsylvania store. To date, that premium has generated over $560 million to our Pennsylvania dairy farmers. To ensure that that pricing is paid to our dairy farmers, we have a very aggressive auditing program. We audit every dealer that buys Pennsylvania milk every month to make sure it's paid at the right price and on time. Moving on through the chain, we also have a regulated wholesale price for fluid milk. That wholesale price is built based on, one, the farm cost, which includes all premiums, not just the mandated premium, but any voluntary premiums or fees that a dairy may pay to a co-op. And we add to that their processing cost, the cost of bringing the milk into the plant, receiving it, standardizing and pasteurizing it, moving it through the bottling area into the cold room, and then delivering that milk. So that's all part of our mandated minimum wholesale price. And moving on through to the retailer is now paying a wholesale price that includes all costs, including the costs for the premiums to the farmers, and we establish a retail minimum that is adds to that wholesale price the cost of getting the milk through the store, getting it in the back door, putting it in the cooler, stocking, rotating, moving it through the checkout, operating the cooler, and any overhead costs. So whenever you look at our system, whenever we do retail price surveys in similar markets, New York being similar to Philadelphia, Baltimore being somewhat similar, we find that Pennsylvania consumers are actually paying about the same or maybe a little less for the products that are most often purchased by consumers. So putting it all together, we have producers that are getting a little bit more through our overorder premium mandated, and consumers that are paying about the same or maybe a little bit less for the products they most like to buy, and everyone in between is happy. It's magic.
I've come to understand that there's very little magic available in agriculture, but I'm glad to hear that some of it exists in Pennsylvania. I was just curious. This is a regulated margin approach. In other words, both the wholesale and the retail margins are regulated by statute. What What is the band for those margins?
The wholesale and retail price generate 2.5% to 3.5% at wholesale and retail. Our law also provides that farmers should also make a profit on selling milk. However, given the nature of how milk moves across state lines, the board has the authority to set the price where it will allow the milk to be marketed. So our farm price fluctuates in lockstep with the national farm price. It's just that it's a little bit higher. We keep that premium at a set rate, about $3 a hundredweight on that Class 1 milk produced, processed, and sold in Pennsylvania.
I do want to get some discussion going between the various panel members that we have here, but let me turn to Rigoberto Lopez now, and then we'll get some discussion going. I will remind you again, if you do have written questions for this panel, go ahead and write them out on a piece of paper, and we'll have someone come through and collect them in a few minutes. But Rigoberto, we want to look a little more in depth now at this issue of margins or price spreads, profit margins or price spreads in the supply chain from farm to retail. And I know you've studied, the issue of market power and market concentration from the industrial organization economics point of view. Where do you come out on the broad question of price spreads and who's making the profit in the supply chain for fluid milk?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. With the exception of Pennsylvania, I'm not going to talk about the rest of the country. Unlike the farm milk price, which is regulated, the fluid milk retail price is not regulated. So the margin between the two reflects, of course, value added, costs such as labor, packaging, and fuel. But it also reflects the result of consolidation of firms in milk processing and the resulting increase in market power and efficiencies. So my research shows that while milk processor consolidation leads to significant cost efficiency gains, it also leads to significant increases in market power, pricing power, milk power. So this leads to higher prices charged for milk sold. And as you sell less milk, you buy less milk, and this would put a downward pressure on either the farm milk price and or the over-order premium. So that is, efficiency effects are not passed on to the consumers or passed down to the farmers. They are retained in the market channel, and I will show you some numbers a little bit later. So my research also shows that there is significant market power of supermarkets over consumers, having the same effect. So the two things combine to produce coalescing power, that is, adversaries would combine to effectively increase the exercise of market power up and down the channel. And this will increase, of course, the spread. So I want to show you a quick picture from the USDA data, actually. Hartford, October 2008. The raw milk price was $1.61 per gallon. The retail price was $3.88 per gallon at supermarkets. That is a spread of $2.27. 6 months later, we hit February 2009, that spread increased to $2.63, the difference between the retail price and the raw milk price. What happened? The retail price dropped 6 cents from $3.88 to $3.82, but the raw milk price dropped 42 cents, a much bigger drop. It's like living like a watermark. So that explained the widening of the margin. So that provides some evidence that there is pricing power. When a farmer has an increasing production cost, they cannot pass on that increase in feed costs, for example, like Buster and Eunice mentioned, to up the channel. However, when retailers or wholesalers face an increasing cost, they have the ability to pass those costs on to up the channel or up to the consumers.
All right. Thank you, Professor Lopez. All right. So let me then take a couple of your statements and first of all, maybe ask Professor Nicholson to react and give us your views. Professor Lopez believes that the fact that, say, in 2009 we saw a much more dramatic decrease in the farm level price for milk than we saw in the retail price as evidence that there's pricing power on the part of retailers. Chuck, what do you have a reaction to that?
First, my reaction is that must be why they put Rigo and I at opposite ends of the table or something. I'm not sure, but I don't do nearly as much work as Rigo does in this particular area, so I don't want to overstep the bounds of my experience or my direct research efforts. But one of the things that I do want us to keep in mind is that we shouldn't use any one year, we shouldn't use any one month or a comparison of two different months as a really definitive comparison of what's happening with the gross marketing margin, in part because of the pricing dynamics, again, that retailers practice. And I'm sure Rigo's done more than I have in this area, but when I've looked at this, there are delays both in raising fluid milk prices when the farm milk cost to fluid milk processors and retailers goes up, and there are also delays bringing those prices back down, and that's the essential nature of price smoothing. So there was a period of time during 2008 when we were seeing actually record high, never seen before milk prices, where fluid milk prices went up by not by as much as the actual costs, probably to the folks who were throughout the rest of the supply chain for fluid milk, and that meant that they were not doing so well financially, presumably, and that's one of the reasons that there was probably some delay in bringing back down the prices, and that's the essence of having a widening marketing margin at that period of time. Since then, we actually have seen the marketing margin, and calculated again as a gross marketing margin, fall back into a range that's lower than the kind of numbers that we saw from the specific data points that Rigo was talking about. So I guess I'm not convinced there isn't an issue with margins in fluid milk pricing, but I think we need to be fairly careful in assuming that the kinds of changes we've seen, particularly in the last few years, are really indicative of that.
All right. Rigo, let me give you a chance to respond, and then maybe we can ask our producers from their point of view. I'm sure they remember 2009 and what they may recall about how they felt about grocery store prices, or maybe they even talked to their grocers. But let's go first to you, Rigo.
Well, I want to clarify that those were only two pictures, but we have done more in-depth studies, to prove the point. So, second, we should keep in mind that the milk is not the only cost, in retailing milk. So there is a lot of non-milk costs which are usually much more stable, such as wages, for example, fuel. Well, that depends on the month as well, but and rental. Capital prices. So, but nonetheless, the fact remains, I think, that even if you account for cost, and we have done that, calculating processing costs, maybe in a similar fashion that Pennsylvania has done, and we have also calculated, and others have calculated, retailing costs. Even accounting for those costs, I think that there is over $1 in profit margins that are left in the market channel beyond the farmer. Otherwise, I don't think you can justify a 250 to 63 margin when the prices are 119 to the farmer, for example.
All right, let me follow up with that. We heard on the earlier panel from the representatives from the Food Marketing Institute, among others, that retail grocery store competition is vigorous and that their margins are very, very thin. How can you square that with what your research shows?
Well, we have estimated the retailing cost of milk to around 50 cents, for example, and processing around 80 cents. So I guess, I should say also that retailing is now facing new forms of competition from big box stores, for example, that are, cutting into their profits. But, however, the prices of milk at the supermarket remain much higher than those prices charged by big box stores. So I don't think that the prices are high enough and stable enough that it will have to exceed the cost that we had calculated for retailing milk and the cost beyond the wholesale. So.
All right, either Eunice or Buster, do you have thoughts about retail pricing of milk and what happens to your milk in the food chain? This may be a little beyond your area of expertise, but let me give you a shot.
When I go grocery shopping for milk, I never look at the price because I feel that milk is a bargain at any price, and it should be. When people said to me, "Oh, milk," people I work with say, "Oh, milk is high," and I says, "Good, you should be paying more." I feel that way. But I think there's a disconnect because when people pay more in the grocery store and our prices are low, they think that we're getting all this money, all the money. We're getting all of it, and they don't understand that there's a lot of complicated issues. And there's a lot of external factors affecting the milk price, and I guess we just don't have confidence. It's a very complicated system. We just don't have confidence. I don't feel that there's a true supply and demand. And we're exporting a lot, and that's helping. And then we got lots of stock of cheese, and we got low inventory of butter. And but yet there's no mention also of the milk protein concentrates that are imported in this country. I don't know if that's ever factored in. So I guess I think that there is the people who get to it before it gets to the shelf are the ones that make the money. I think my father always said to me, "There's money in farming, but it's after it leaves the farm gate."
Buster?
It's hard to follow Eunice, by the way. When we had the record highs in 06 or 07, I forget now, it's so far away, but there was a lot of national press talking about the high milk prices and what the farmer was receiving. So, we really, or the retailers had the opportunity to say, here, this is why we're selling our milk at a higher level, because of what you hear in the press, that the farmers are getting the higher price. But another thing, Rigo, I did a little research myself. It's kind of old research. It was between 73 and 98 when I was marketing milk into grocery stores. But every day I walked into these grocery stores and marketed my milk on a wholesale level. And this was wholesale through our dairy herd and then wholesale through our milk plant. And it was always a pretty standard 30% increase from what I sold milk to the store and what the store sold to the customer. I don't know what their costs are, but it was pretty general that was what the difference in the margins were between what I sold to them and what they sold to the consumer. You hear a lot about milk being a loss leader, and the only experience I have with that is if I ever wanted to be a part of that, I would be the one that had to reduce my price.
Thank you. You brought up the topic of milk as a loss leader. But let me go to that. First of all, David DeSantis, I guess because of the way that Pennsylvania regulates the retail margins, minimum margins, milk can't be sold as a loss leader in Pennsylvania. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Actually, you have the opposite occurring. There seems to be, in some markets, a retail culture that puts the price up a little bit. And you can understand why that would happen. If you have a inner city store that is buying 2 or 3 cases of milk, it's quite expensive for them to market that milk. So you're going to find that well over our minimum price. But on the other side of it, stores that are in highly competitive areas will go down to our minimum. Our minimum becomes the maximum. And the good thing about our system is that the price wars can be very destructive to the people that are supplying the stores. If you're in competition with a store down the street to lower the price of milk, you're going to ask your supplier for a better price or you're going to lose the business. The supplier, in turn, is going to go back to the farmer and say, we can't pay premiums this month. You don't see that in Pennsylvania. You don't see it in a regulated environment like we have.
So, all right, this is the approach in Pennsylvania. I understand New York has a slightly different approach, New York State, where they tie the retail price of milk to some multiple of a farm level price. I guess my question to the economist would be, is this type of regulation a good thing or a bad thing? Regulation that would prevent a retailer from having full pricing flexibility for fluid milk? Maybe we'll go to you, Chuck.
All right, just since I used to work in New York at Cornell before I went to Cal Poly, I'll just say a bit about the New York, what's called the milk price gouging law, which was passed in 1991, largely in response to the kind of issue where the farm price had dropped and the retail price didn't come down as quickly as the farm price. That law basically specifies a maximum margin that can be earned by other agencies in the marketing chain, that is the processors and the retailers. And that multiple is something like the number 2. And what has been observed is that ratio is pretty much the price that gets charged, or maybe actually even a little bit more. There are certain allowances in New York City, but in most of the upstate markets that markup is not binding. It's not something that sets actually what the price of milk will be. So, and it's interesting that in New York and Pennsylvania, 2 neighboring states, you have a minimum margin law and a maximum margin law, presumably designed to try and achieve the same thing. What I'll say in terms of the kind of general approach to thinking about doing something about margins, again, I think the challenge that I have in sort of warming up to the idea that this is something that should be addressed is that I think we lose sight of probably the more important issue for dairy producers, which is really the tremendous price volatility and the periods of particularly low prices and high costs that cause them significant financial distress. And I have done some recent work in preparation for this workshop that tends to suggest that if we really want to deal with the issue of those low price periods, we need to be thinking about other programs and not so much worrying about what the margin is between the farm and the retail level. And that may sound kind of funny, but the basic idea, though, is that we have programs in place that could probably be more effectively used to support dairy farmers. We have new proposals from the national dairy organizations that I think would actually be much more effective in trying to deal with the severe pain that we've seen as typified by the last couple of years.
Okay. Rigoberto, do you have any thoughts?
Okay. So there are two important characteristics of this type of proposal that I see from Pennsylvania and from New York, is that they pertain to state regulation, first of all. And second, the second important characteristic is that we are getting the money to rebalance the margins in the channel from the market itself. It's not coming from government subsidies. It's coming from the market channel itself. So those are 2 important points, I think. So I think that another point that I want to make is that an unregulated market, or a so-called free market, is not necessarily a fair market. It's not necessarily competitive either. So we have to really address this question in the context of whether the status quo is competitive and it is fair. So I think that this will be a good start, looking at this type of regulation to start addressing some of these questions on behalf of all institutions in the vertical market channel. And I want to make one last point about being a loss leader. I think that the people used to talk more about milk about 20 years ago, and it's clearly a loss leader in some of the gas stations, perhaps, some new stores like Aldi, perhaps, that is employing penetration pricing, but it's no longer the case. I think the dairy section of supermarkets, for example, is among the most profitable ones for supermarkets. So the leader has found its way, if it was ever lost in the last 20 years.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to kind of comment a little bit about what Chuck was talking about. I believe we as producers are probably closer to agreeing with some sort of program than we've ever been. Of course, not all of us, but some of the things that we've worked towards is putting together something called Foundation for the Future. And some of the things that are in this is readdressing how we look at federal orders, addressing market margin insurance. That's tying your feed cost with your milk price and having some sort of insurance for that margin, and also addressing supply management. So hopefully this is going to continue to go forward, and hopefully it will be considered sooner than later.
Did you want to say anything, Eunice?
Well, there's been a lot of proposals, and I'm not I heard from our Congressman from Minnesota, Colin Peterson's, some of his ideas, and he's not, right now everything's in the discussion stages, and nobody's really signed on to anything because there's problems with all of them. But I do think we need supply management, and I think that's very important. And we also need to deal with this phantom milk supply of milk protein concentrates that's coming in, and it's not recognized as a dairy product, so it's not assessed as an import. It just has to be dealt with because it's there, and it's generally accepted, but it should be dealt with because it isn't really factored into the pricing. So I just hopefully that this today will bring an awareness so that we realize the importance of getting a strong dairy policy.
Thank you. I think what we'll do, since we're getting near the end of this panel, is we'll take one audience question that we've gotten. It's a good question, and it would be directed at our colleague from Pennsylvania. The question is, what are the barriers to entry in Pennsylvania to keep all dairy producers from coming in and taking advantage of the magic in Pennsylvania?
And the answer is you can't put up barriers. We tried to encourage the Department of Transportation to not plow the roads at the borders, but that won't work, you know. So the adage is money moves milk and more money moves more milk. So if our price is very disparate from the surrounding markets, then we will invite milk in, usually from west to east and from north to south. There's a lot of milk in New York that could invade our markets very easily. Plus we have importing retailers that don't buy their milk in any regulated way or that's under our control. So someone like Aldi or Costco does bring milk into the state, and they bought it at prices that were not under our control. So we have to be very sensitive whenever we set the overorder premium so that it doesn't create such an incentive that dealers and retailers don't bring the milk in just to evade the premium.
Well, thank you very much, all the members of this panel. Obviously, this dialogue will continue to be ongoing, and thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was a lot of fun.